All right, let's go. Number 10. Fryceland. In 1558, a Venetian nobleman named Niccolo Zeno the Younger published a manuscript and a map he claimed to have rescued from a pile of family correspondence written nearly 2 centuries earlier. The documents purported to describe the voyages of his ancestors, the brothers Niccolo and Antonio Zeno, who had supposedly sailed the North Atlantic in 1380 under the patronage of a mysterious northern prince. The map that accompanied the manuscript showed something extraordinary. South of Iceland, in waters that European fishermen and Norse navigators had crossed for centuries, sat a substantial island. Its coastline was rendered in meticulous detail. Its harbors were named. Its capes and bays were labeled with the precision of a cartographer who had walked its shores. The island was called Fryceland. Within a generation, Fryceland was everywhere. Gerardus Mercator, the most respected cartographer of the 16th century, the man whose projection still defines how we visualize the globe, included Fryceland in his atlas. Abraham Ortelius placed it in his. The island appeared on official charts produced for the navies of Spain, England, and the Dutch Republic. For roughly 150 years, no serious European map of the North Atlantic was considered complete without it. Friesland was treated not as rumor, not as legend, but as fixed geography. Sailors were warned about its coastal hazards. Diplomats referenced it in territorial negotiations. Explorers planned routes around it. The detail given to the island defies easy explanation. Cartographers rendered Fryceland with more than a dozen labeled harbors and capes. Its coastline showed inlets, peninsulas, and offshore islets drawn with the kind of specificity that suggests direct observation. Compare this to the maps of the same era depicting Iceland, a real island that European fleets visited routinely. Fryceland often received more geographic detail than Iceland, more named features, more carefully rendered topography. The Phantom Island was, on paper, better documented than several real ones. The numbers compound the strangeness. For approximately 150 years, across at least 4 major cartographic traditions, in atlases printed in Venice, Antwerp, Amsterdam, and London, Fryceland persisted. Generations of mapmakers copied it from their predecessors. Generations of navigators carried it in their charts. Generations of merchants and monarchs accepted its existence as established fact. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Fryceland was not a casual error. It was not a smudge misread by a copyist or a misplaced sketch of Iceland under a different name. The Zeno map placed Fryceland in a specific location with specific coordinates. It described the island's interior, its political structure, its trading relationships with the surrounding northern world. The level of fabrication required to invent it from nothing exceeds what we would expect from a 16th century forger trying to glorify his family name. Something was being recorded. The question is what? Then, sometime in the late 17th century, Fryceland began to disappear. Not in a single moment of correction, not through a published retraction, not through any dramatic announcement that the island had never existed. It simply faded from successive editions of the great atlases. Cartographers stopped copying it. Navigators stopped searching for it. The harbors that had been named and labeled and warned about for a century and a half were quietly removed from the charts. No one explained where they had gone. No one explained how they had been there in the first place. The island that had occupied the North Atlantic on every serious map of European exploration was simply edited out of existence, as if it had been a stain the cartographers had finally agreed to clean. What remains is the unsettling residue of a 150-year consensus. Hundreds of maps still survive in museum collections and archives across Europe, each one showing Fryceland exactly where it was supposed to be. The harbors are still labeled. The capes still bear their names. The island sits there in faded ink, perfectly drawn, perfectly placed, and perfectly absent from the ocean it was supposed to occupy. Number 9. High Brazil. In 1325, the Majorcan cartographer Angelino Dulcert drew a circular island in the Atlantic, southwest of Ireland, and labeled it High Brazil. He was not speculating. He was working within the rigorous Portolan tradition, the same school of charting that mapped real harbors, real coastlines, real trade routes used by working sailors. His map was a navigational document, not a fantasy. And on it, beneath the coast of Ireland, sat a perfect circle of land bisected by a single channel of water, as if someone had drawn a wheel and cut it in half. That circular island did not disappear from the cartographic record for the next 500 years. High Brazil appeared on Catalan charts, Genoese charts, Venetian charts, Portuguese charts. It appeared on the 1375 Catalan Atlas. It appeared on Ortelius. It appeared on maps printed in Amsterdam in the 17th century, on British Admiralty charts into the early 19th, and on at least one published reference as late as 1865. The shape almost never varied. A circle, a straight running through the middle, sometimes two crescents facing each other across the water. The consistency is what makes High Brazil different from a casual mistake. Cartographers separated by centuries, working in different ports for different patrons, kept drawing the same island in the same place with the same distinctive geometry. They were copying something. The question is what? The English took it seriously enough to spend money on it. In 1480, a Bristol merchant named Thomas Lloyd outfitted a ship called the Trinity and sailed west into the Atlantic to find High Brazil. He returned having found nothing. In 1481, two more Bristol ships, the George and the Trinity again, were dispatched on the same mission. The expedition records survive in the customs accounts of the port. These were not pleasure cruises or speculative ventures by eccentrics. They were commercial voyages, capitalized and crewed, sent to locate an island that the merchants of Bristol believed was findable. They believed it because their charts told them it was there. The charts had been telling sailors it was there for over 150 years. The expeditions failed. The island did not. It kept appearing on new maps drawn by new hands. The circle and the straight reproduced again and again, as if the cartographic tradition could not let it go. And then came the sightings. Sailors returning from Atlantic crossings reported reaching it, walking on it, trading with its inhabitants. A captain named John Nisbet claimed to have landed there in 1674 with a crew of 4, who reportedly stayed the night and returned with gold and silver. As late as 1872, a man named Robert O'Flaherty described seeing it from the Irish coast, rising out of a fog bank to the west, fully formed and inhabited. The folklore that accumulated around these accounts gave the island a strange rule. It was visible only once every 7 years, and only when the mist parted at the correct hour. The rest of the time it was hidden, submerged, withdrawn, beneath some veil that the ordinary world could not penetrate. The folklore is dismissible. The cartography is not. What makes High Brazil particularly unsettling is the duration. Fryceland lived on maps for 150 years before vanishing. High Brazil lived on them for more than 500. It survived the printing press. It survived the age of telescopic navigation. It survived the systematic British charting of the entire North Atlantic. It survived expedition after expedition that came back empty-handed. Mapmakers kept drawing the circle and the straight long after the men who actually sailed those waters had concluded the island could not be reached. The cartographic memory outlived the operational reality by centuries. Somewhere in the chain of copied charts, a piece of geographic information was preserved that no living sailor could verify and no failed expedition could erase. We do not know what that information originally was. We do not know who first drew the circle or what they were drawing it from. We know only that the shape persisted, generation after generation, on the maps of serious men who had no reason to fool themselves. The circle is still there. It sits in archives, in the Dulcet Chart of 1325, and the Pizzigano Portolans and the Mercator Atlases, southwest of Ireland, waiting in the same place it has always waited. Number 8. St. Brendan's Island. Around the year 1300, the monks who assembled the Hereford Mappa Mundi, the largest surviving medieval map of the world, inked an island into the western Atlantic and labeled it for an Irish abbot who had died 700 years earlier. The same island appears again on Martin Behaim's terrestrial globe in 1492, the oldest surviving globe in the world, constructed in Nuremberg in the exact year Columbus sailed west. For nearly 2 centuries between those two cartographic monuments, and for 2 centuries after, St. Brendan's Island held a fixed place on the maps that Europe used to understand the shape of the ocean. It was not a marginal notation. It was geography. The source was a manuscript called the Navigatio Sancti Brendani, the Voyage of St. Brendan, copied and recopied across medieval Europe in at least 120 surviving Latin versions. It described the journey of a 6th century Irish monk named Brendan of Clonfert, who set sail from the western coast of Ireland with a small crew of brothers in a leather-hulled boat called a curragh. They were searching for the Isle of the Blessed, a paradise promised to the faithful somewhere beyond the western horizon. According to the Navigatio, they sailed for 7 years, and what they described seeing along the way is the reason this entry exists. Brendan's account speaks of giant pillars of crystal rising from the sea, transparent columns the color of silver that the monks rode beneath in awe. He describes an island that hurled fire at their boat as they passed, blackening their sails with ash, and a mountain that roared and spat molten rock into the sky. He describes a sea so thick with mist that the boundary between water and air dissolved. He describes a frozen ocean. He describes a land of perpetual day. For centuries, scholars read these passages as religious allegory. Crystal pillars were symbols of divine purity. Fire-throwing islands were the gates of hell. The voyage was a spiritual parable dressed in nautical clothing. But here's where the standard interpretation begins to fracture. A 6th century Irish monk would have no reference point for an iceberg. The North Atlantic icebergs that calve from Greenland and drift south through what mariners now call Iceberg Alley are translucent, towering, and silver blue in certain light. They float in groups. Crews who pass beneath them describe a sensation indistinguishable from rowing beneath cathedrals of glass. Brendan's crystal pillars match the phenomenon in shape, in color, in behavior, in scale. The fire-throwing island is harder to dismiss as metaphor. Iceland sits directly along the route a curragh would drift if it followed the prevailing currents northwest from Ireland. Iceland's volcanoes erupt frequently. The eruptions hurl pyroclastic material into the air and blacken the sky for kilometers. A 6th century sailor with no concept of volcanism would describe exactly what Brendan describes: an island that throws fire at passing ships and mountains that vomit stone. In 1976, the British navigator and explorer Tim Severin set out to test whether the voyage was even physically possible. He built a replica curragh using oak frames, ox hides, and the construction techniques described in early Irish sources. He sailed it from Ireland to Iceland to Greenland to Newfoundland, the same stepping stones that the Navigatio appears to describe in sequence. He made the crossing. The leather boat held. He reached North America. The implication is that the Navigatio may not be allegory at all. It may be a navigational memoir, encoded in the religious vocabulary available to a 6th century Irish monastic community, describing a real voyage that touched real icebergs, real volcanoes, and possibly real American coastline 900 years before Columbus drew his first chart. The medieval cartographers who placed St. Brendan's Island in the Atlantic were not indulging in fantasy. They were recording what their best available source told them was out there. And the island remained on serious European maps for over 500 years, drifting slightly in latitude from chart to chart, but never disappearing, because no one could prove it was not there. The last documented expedition to find it sailed from the Canary Islands in 1721. It returned empty-handed. The island was quietly erased from later editions. Whatever Brendan saw is still out there, scattered across the North Atlantic in pieces. The mapmakers simply assembled it into a single shape and waited for someone to confirm what they had drawn. Number 7. Antilia, the Isle of Seven Cities. In 1424, a Venetian cartographer named Juan Pizzigano produced a portolan chart that would shape the next century of Atlantic exploration. Drawn on vellum, inked with the meticulous precision that defined the great Italian map-making houses, the chart depicted the known coastlines of Europe and North Africa, with the kind of empirical detail that working sailors demanded. These were not decorative documents. Portolan charts were navigation instruments, drawn by men whose reputations depended on accuracy. A mistake meant a ship on the rocks. A mistake meant dead men. And yet, west of Portugal, in the open Atlantic where no European had yet sailed, Pizzigano drew an island. It was rectangular, almost suspiciously geometric, larger than many of the real islands on the same chart, rendered in vivid red ink that bled across the parchment like a wound. Along its coasts, the cartographer had marked 7 distinct bays, each labeled with the name of a city. The island had a name, Antilia, the Isle of Seven Cities. The legend behind it was already centuries old by the time Pizzigano set ink to vellum. In 714 AD, as Moorish armies swept across the Iberian Peninsula and the Visigothic kingdom collapsed, 7 Portuguese bishops were said to have gathered their congregations, boarded ships, and fled west into the Atlantic. They sailed beyond the horizon. They never returned. According to the story preserved in Iberian oral tradition and later codified in monastic chronicles, the bishops found an island in the deep ocean, far from any known shore. They burned their ships so no one could turn back. And on that island they founded 7 cities, one for each bishop, where Christian civilization would survive intact, hidden from the world that had betrayed it. For 700 years, this remained a story. Then a Venetian cartographer drew it onto a working navigation chart, and the story became geography. What happened next is the part historians find most unsettling. Antilia did not appear once and vanish. It proliferated. Dozens of 15th century portolan charts reproduced the rectangular island, refined its coastlines, adjusted its position, named and renamed its 7 cities. Cartographers in Genoa, in Lisbon, in Majorca copied it from one another, each adding their own details. The island acquired companions. Smaller phantom landmasses appeared beside it. The Atlantic, on these charts, began to fill with land that no one had ever visited. By the time Christopher Columbus began planning his voyage, Antilia was no longer a legend. It was a waypoint. Columbus owned charts that depicted it. He studied them. He calculated distances using its presumed position as a navigational anchor. When he sailed west in 1492, he expected to make landfall at Antilia before reaching the coast of Asia. The Isle of Seven Cities was, in his mind, a confirmed feature of the Atlantic, a stepping stone between Europe and the Indies. He sailed past where it should have been and found nothing. He kept sailing. What he eventually found was not Antilia, but the islands he encountered in the Caribbean were named, in part, in its memory. The Antilles, the Greater Antilles, the Lesser Antilles. The Phantom Island gave its name to a real archipelago that it had never been. The truly disturbing aspect is what this reveals about the relationship between maps and reality. For nearly a century, the most sophisticated navigators in Europe believed in an island that did not exist. They drew it. They taught it to apprentices. They used it to plan voyages that altered the course of human history. The discovery of the Americas was undertaken, in part, in pursuit of a place that had never been there. whether the bishops sailed at all, whether they reached some real shore now forgotten, whether the story preserved a memory of an actual Atlantic refuge or invented one whole, none of these questions can be answered. The 7 cities, if they were ever built, are gone. The bishops, if they ever sailed, are gone. What remains is the red ink on the Pizzigano chart, the rectangular island west of Portugal, and the 7 labeled bays where, according to a story no one can verify, Christian civilization once hid from the end of the world. Number 6. Thule. In 1539, the Swedish cleric Olaus Magnus published the Carta Marina, one of the most detailed maps of northern Europe ever produced. In the upper reaches of that map, north of Iceland, north of the known world, he marked a single name, Thule. He was not inventing it. He was repeating it. The same name appears in the geographic works of Claudius Ptolemy from the 2nd century AD, embedded in coordinates that European cartographers would copy and recopy for over 1,000 years. Thule was a place. The maps agreed on that. They simply could not agree on where it was. The original witness was a Greek explorer named Pytheas of Massalia. Around 325 BC, sailing from what is now Marseille, Pytheas pushed past the Pillars of Hercules, rounded the British Isles, and continued north into waters no Mediterranean traveler had ever charted. His account, On the Ocean, has been lost. We know it only through fragments preserved by later writers who quoted him, often to mock him. Pytheas described a land 6 days' sail north of Britain. He called it Thule, and what he reported from that voyage was so strange that Greek geographers spent the next 6 centuries arguing about whether he had been lying. He described a sea that was frozen, not cold, frozen. He described a sun that did not fully set in summer, a horizon where day refused to end, where the boundary between sky and sea blurred into a single continuous twilight. And he described something stranger still, a substance in the water that was neither air nor liquid nor solid. He called it sea lung. The Greek word he used suggested something that breathed, something that pulsed, a material that could not be walked on and could not be sailed through. Modern readers have proposed 2 explanations. The first is slush ice, the granular semi-frozen seawater that forms in polar regions as winter advances, a medium that consumes oars and refuses hulls. The second is a dense bloom of jellyfish, the kind that can carpet northern waters for kilometers, turning the ocean into a gelatinous mass that moves with the swell. Either explanation places Pytheas exactly where he claimed to be, at the edge of the ice, at the boundary where the temperate world ends and the polar world begins. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. We still cannot say what Thule was. The candidates have multiplied rather than narrowed. Some scholars argue for Iceland, citing the 6-day sailing distance and the descriptions of perpetual summer light. Others argue for the coast of Norway, where the midnight sun behaves exactly as Pytheas described, and where ice forms along the fjords in winter. Others still argue for the Shetland Islands, closer to Britain and consistent with the navigational technology of the 4th century BC. Each candidate fits some of the evidence. None fits all of it. A Greek explorer described a real place in real detail using real sensory observation, and 23 centuries later, we cannot identify the coastline he stood on. What makes Thule particularly unsettling is what its persistence reveals about the limits of cartography itself. Ptolemy marked it. Olaus Magnus marked it. Medieval monks copied it from manuscript to manuscript. Renaissance cartographers reproduced it in ink and parchment. For 1,600 years, European mapmakers preserved the coordinates of a place no living person could verify, because the original witness had described it with such specificity that erasing it felt like erasing knowledge. They trusted Pytheas. They simply could not retrace his route. The maps remembered Thule long after the sailors who might have confirmed it were gone. Somewhere north of Britain, 6 days under sail. There is a coastline that a Greek explorer walked on in the 4th century BC. He saw the frozen sea. He saw the sun that would not set. He brought the word back, and the word survived. The land he described is still there. We are simply no longer certain which land it is. Number 5. Tartessos. In the marshlands at the mouth of the Guadalquivir River in southern Spain, beneath layers of silt and sand and the protected wetlands of Doñana National Park, archaeologists have been digging since 2010 in search of a kingdom that ancient maps insisted was there. Greek and Phoenician traders carried charts that placed it precisely. The Bible called it Tarshish. Herodotus described its wealth as a thing that had to be witnessed to be believed. Strabo, writing centuries later, called it the oldest civilization in Iberia, a trading kingdom of such extravagance that the standard rules of economic plausibility no longer applied. And then it was gone. Around 500 BC, Tartessos vanished from the historical record, not conquered in any campaign that ancient historians bothered to chronicle, not destroyed in any war that left a named battlefield. The kingdom that had supplied silver to half the Mediterranean simply stopped existing. Greek writers who had described it as a living trading partner began writing about it as a memory. Within a few generations, no one could say with certainty where its capital had stood. But here's where the standard skepticism falls apart. The maps never let it go. Phoenician trade routes, copied and recopied across centuries, kept marking the Tartessian coast as a destination. Greek geographers preserved its position near the Guadalquivir, even as the kingdom itself faded into legend. The ancient cartographic record refused to surrender what the historical record had abandoned. For more than 2,000 years, scholars debated whether the mapmakers were preserving genuine geography or copying a fiction that had been embedded in the trade charts so long, no one remembered to remove it. The wealth described in those ancient accounts was the kind that strains credulity. Strabo reported that the silver mines of the region were so productive, so absurdly abundant, that Phoenician trading vessels exhausted their cargo holds and still had silver left to transport. According to the accounts that filtered down through Greek and Roman writers, the ships cast their anchors from solid silver to carry the surplus home. Anchors. Cast. From silver. The detail is so extravagant it reads like myth, the kind of embellishment that ancient historians invented to dramatize a foreign land. Except that the silver deposits of the Iberian Peninsula are real, and they were among the richest in the ancient world, and the Phoenicians did become fabulously wealthy from extracting them. The Bible's reference to Tarshish carries the same impossible glitter. Ships of Tarshish brought gold and silver and exotic animals to Solomon's court. The Hebrew prophets used the name as shorthand for the farthest reach of the known world, a place at the edge of geography where wealth flowed from sources too distant to verify. The kingdom appeared in scripture, in Greek histories, in Phoenician trade documents, and on every serious chart of the Western Mediterranean. 4 independent literary traditions, separated by language and theology and centuries, all pointing to the same stretch of southern Iberian coastline. In 2010, a team led by researchers from the Spanish National Research Council began systematically excavating sites within Doñana National Park, the vast wetland complex where the Guadalquivir empties into the Atlantic. What they have uncovered is not yet a confirmed capital. It is something more cautious and more provocative. Geometric structures buried beneath the marshes. Foundations aligned in patterns inconsistent with natural geology. Sediment layers that suggest the landscape was reshaped, possibly by tsunami, possibly by earthquake, possibly by both, around the exact period Tartessos disappears from the written record. The implications are staggering. If the Doñana excavations continue to yield what they have begun to suggest, then the ancient cartographers were right. The Phoenician trade maps were not preserving a myth. They were preserving a memory of a real kingdom that drowned beneath the marshes of southern Spain 25 centuries ago, its silver mines exhausted, its harbors silted shut, its name surviving only because traders kept marking the spot long after the city itself was gone. What makes Tartessos particularly significant in any catalog of vanished places is the trajectory of its rediscovery. For most of recorded history, it sat in the category of legend. The maps insisted, the historians doubted. And then the ground beneath Doñana began giving up its evidence, one geometric foundation at a time. The kingdom that the ancient cartographers refused to erase may finally be re-emerging from the silt that swallowed it, 2.5 millennia after the Mediterranean forgot it was ever there. It is the rarest outcome in this entire countdown, a map that may have been right all along. Number 4. Hyperborea, the paradise at the top of the world. In 1595, the most respected cartographer of the European Renaissance, Gerardus Mercator, published a map of the Arctic. Mercator was not a fabulist. He was the man who solved the problem of representing a curved Earth on a flat page, whose projection still hangs in classrooms 4 centuries later, whose name is shorthand for cartographic rigor itself. And at the top of his polar map, where modern atlases show only ice and ocean, Mercator drew a land called Hyperborea. He drew it carefully. 4 symmetrical land masses arranged around the pole, split from one another by 4 rushing rivers that poured inward toward a single point. At the center of the 4 islands stood a black mountain. Mercator labeled it Rupes Nigra, the Black Rock, and described it as a magnetic stone 33 leagues across, drawing the waters of the world toward itself in a vast oceanic spiral. The sea did not lap against Hyperborea. It was devoured by it. This was not a marginal sketch. This was the official polar geography of the most authoritative mapmaker of his century. The name itself was already 2,000 years old when Mercator inked it. Hyperborea, the land beyond the north wind, appears in Herodotus in the 5th century BC and in the Odes of Pindar a generation earlier. The Greeks described it as a sunlit country, lying past the source of the cold, where the air was warm, where grain grew without labor, where the inhabitants lived 1,000 years and died only when they grew tired of living. They were said to worship Apollo. They were said to have no disease, no war, no aging. A paradise positioned precisely where the geography should be most hostile. For 2 millennia, the idea persisted. Roman geographers repeated it. Medieval scribes copied it into their reproductions of Greek originals. And when Mercator sat down to render the polar regions in the late 16th century, he treated the Greek accounts as source material, the same way he treated Ptolemy's descriptions of the Mediterranean. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Mercator did not draw Hyperborea from imagination. He cited a source. In a letter written in 1577 to the English mathematician John Dee, Mercator referenced a now-lost text called the Inventio Fortunata, attributed to a 14th century English friar who had supposedly traveled to the Arctic and returned with a description of the 4 islands and the central Black Mountain. Mercator copied his polar geography from a traveler's account that he believed to be empirical. The 4 landmasses, the inward flowing rivers, the magnetic rock at the pole, these were not myth to him. They were reported observations, transcribed in good faith. The Inventio Fortunata is gone. No copy survives. We know it existed only because Mercator and others cited it. Whatever the friar saw, whatever he wrote, whatever fragments of polar reality or polar hallucination he carried south with him, the document itself vanished sometime in the 15th century. What remains is its shadow, pressed into the corner of a Renaissance map. The implications are uncomfortable. The geography Mercator drew is wrong. There is no Rupes Nigra. There are no 4 symmetrical islands. The pole is ocean, ice, and the slow gyre of currents that no medieval friar could have charted. And yet the persistence is staggering. a description that began with Herodotus, that survived through Pindar and Pliny, that was confirmed by an Arctic traveler in the 1300s, and rendered as official cartography in the 1500s, was held as geographic truth for over 2,000 consecutive years. Something was there in the cultural memory of the North. Whether it was a real landmass remembered from a warmer climatic age, whether it was the polar mirage that sailors still report, distant cliffs and mountains hanging above the ice that dissolve when approached, whether it was something else entirely, the Greeks were certain enough to write it down, and Mercator was certain enough to draw it. The Black Mountain at the center of the world is not on any modern map. But for most of recorded history, the people who knew the most about geography believed it was there. Number 3. Mu and Lemuria. In 1864, a British zoologist named Philip Sclater sat down to solve a problem that had been quietly tormenting natural historians for decades. Lemur fossils were appearing in places that made no biological sense. Madagascar, predictably. India, less predictably. Scattered remains across the intervening geography in patterns that defied every model of how a species should disperse. The animals could not have swum the distances involved. The landmasses had no connection any geographer of the period could identify. Yet, the bones existed, distributed across thousands of kilometers of ocean, as if some vanished bridge had once linked them. Sclater proposed the bridge. He named it Lemuria. His paper, published in the Quarterly Journal of Science, suggested that a sunken landmass had once stretched across the Indian Ocean, allowing lemur populations to migrate between what are now isolated continents. This was not mysticism. This was a working zoologist applying the science of his era to a genuine biogeographic puzzle. The continent was a hypothesis, drawn to make the fossil record cohere. Other respected scientists, including Ernst Haeckel, picked up the idea and extended it, suggesting Lemuria might even be the cradle of humanity itself. Then the occultists arrived. By the late 19th century, Lemuria had escaped the laboratory. Theosophists adopted it as the home of a vanished root race. American writer James Churchward expanded the concept into something far grander, claiming access to ancient tablets that described a Pacific continent called Mu, a vast green landmass stretching from Hawaii to Easter Island, populated by 64 million people who had achieved a civilization more advanced than anything in the modern world. Churchward's speculative maps appeared throughout the early 20th century, showing Mu as a sprawling continent dotted with pyramid cities, temple complexes, and rivers that now lie beneath kilometers of Pacific water. The maps were detailed. The maps were confident. The maps were sold in popular books to enormous audiences who wanted to believe. The maps were also, by the standards of mid-20th century geology, completely impossible. When plate tectonics emerged as the dominant model of continental movement in the 1960s, both Lemuria and Mu collapsed. Continents do not sink. The seafloor of the Pacific and Indian Oceans showed no evidence of submerged landmasses of the kind Churchward described. The lemur fossil distribution that had launched Sclater's original hypothesis turned out to be explained by something far stranger and more elegant. Continents themselves had moved. India and Madagascar had once been joined as part of the supercontinent Gondwana. The lemurs had not crossed a sunken bridge. The land beneath them had drifted apart. The case appeared closed. Lemuria and Mu joined the catalog of disproven 19th century speculations, alongside phlogiston and the luminiferous ether. But here's where the story becomes genuinely unsettling. In 2017, a team of geologists publishing in the Geological Society of America's Journal announced the formal confirmation of a submerged continent. Not in the Indian Ocean, not in the Pacific Basin Churchward had mapped, but adjacent beneath the waters around New Zealand. They called it Zealandia, a continental landmass roughly 5 million square kilometers in size, 94% of which lies beneath the ocean surface. New Zealand and New Caledonia are its exposed peaks. The rest is drowned, its continental crust extending across an area larger than India, hidden beneath an average of more than a kilometer of seawater. A real sunken continent, confirmed by modern science, in the precise region where 19th century speculators had been drawing imaginary ones. The truly disturbing aspect is what this does to the category itself. For over a century, sunken continent functioned as shorthand for pseudoscience, the kind of claim that marked a thinker as outside the boundaries of serious geography. Then the seafloor was mapped with sufficient precision, and the category turned out to contain at least one real entry. Zealandia is not Mu. It has no pyramid cities. It was submerged long before any human could have walked its surface. But its existence forces a reckoning with how confidently the discipline once dismissed the possibility. Churchward's maps remain wrong. His 64 million Pacific citizens never existed. The pyramid cities beneath Hawaii are not there. But somewhere in the layered history of bad cartography and worse cosmology, a real drowned continent was waiting to be found. And it took until the 21st century to admit it was there at all. Number 2. The Kingdom of Prester John. In 1165, a letter began circulating through the courts of Europe. It was addressed to the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I Komnenos, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, and the Pope. The author identified himself as Prester John, a Christian priest-king ruling Aishauchir's vast empire somewhere beyond the known world. The letter described a kingdom of impossible wealth, populated by giants and griffins, watered by a river that flowed directly from the Garden of Eden. Within decades, the letter had been copied into hundreds of manuscripts across the continent. Within a century, Prester John appeared on the 1265 Ebstorf map, one of the most ambitious cartographic works of the medieval period. He was no longer a rumor. He was geography. The letter was almost certainly a forgery. The kingdom appeared on maps anyway. For the next 400 years, European monarchs, popes, and explorers operated under the assumption that Prester John's realm was a real place that could be located, contacted, and allied with. The Ebstorf cartographer placed him in Asia, ruling a Christian buffer state beyond the Islamic caliphates. 2 centuries later, Fra Mauro's 1459 map relocated him to Africa, somewhere in the highlands south of Egypt. The kingdom drifted across continents as European knowledge expanded and the empty spaces on the map contracted. When Asia filled in with verified detail, Prester John was simply moved. The mapmakers refused to delete him. They only repositioned him into whatever territory remained unexplored. The descriptions are extraordinary. He was said to be descended from the Magi, the 3 kings who had brought gifts to the infant Christ, ruling an unbroken Christian lineage in a land the Roman Church had lost contact with. His palace was constructed of crystal walls that admitted no shadow. Its ceilings were panels of solid sapphire. A magical mirror in his throne room reportedly displayed every province of his kingdom simultaneously, allowing him to govern by sight alone. The fountain of youth bubbled somewhere within his borders. So did a river that flowed not from any earthly source, but directly from Eden itself, carrying with it gemstones and fragments of paradise downstream toward his court. None of this was treated as metaphor. It was treated as intelligence. Pope Alexander III sent a personal physician named Philip into Asia in 1177, carrying a letter for Prester John. Philip vanished. He was never heard from again. The Portuguese crown, 2 centuries later, made contact with Prester John, the central strategic objective of its African expeditions. Prince Henry the Navigator, the founding architect of the Age of Exploration, justified his sponsorship of voyages down the African coast, partly as a search for the Christian king, who would help encircle the Islamic world. King Juan II sent the explorer Pero de Covilhã overland through Egypt to Ethiopia in 1487 with explicit orders to find him. Vasco da Gama's voyage around the Cape of Good Hope in 1497 carried letters of introduction prepared for Prester John's court. This is the part that should be sat with carefully. The ships that mapped the African coastline, that opened the sea route to India, that initiated the global trade networks defining the modern world, were partly chasing a phantom from a forged letter. The age of exploration was driven, in measurable part, by the search for a king who did not exist. When Portuguese diplomats finally reached the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia in the early 16th century, they decided this must be the place. The Ethiopian emperor was politely informed that he was Prester John. He had never heard the name. The Crystal Palace was not there. The sapphire ceilings were not there. The river from Eden was not there. The fountain of youth was not there. The Magi lineage was not there. What was there was a real Christian kingdom of considerable antiquity, but it bore no resemblance to the cartographic phantom Europe had been pursuing for 4 centuries. The mapmakers had constructed an entire civilization out of a letter, and reality had failed to supply the inventory. Prester John gradually faded from European maps over the following 2 centuries. He was never formally retracted. He simply stopped being drawn. What remains is the unsettling residue of his cartographic career. A forged document became a geographic certainty. A geographic certainty redirected the resources of empires. The redirected resources reshaped the planet. The phantom did not need to exist to alter history. It only needed to be drawn on a map and believed. Number 1. Atlantis, the continent that refuses to die. In 1669, a German Jesuit scholar named Athanasius Kircher published a map that should not exist. Kircher was no fringe figure. He was one of the most respected polymaths of the 17th century, a man whose work shaped the foundations of geology, Egyptology, and comparative linguistics. And yet, in his monumental work, Mundus Subterraneus, he inserted a single page that has haunted cartographers ever since. A map of Atlantis, drawn with the same precision he brought to volcanic systems and underground rivers, labeled, oriented, geographically positioned, treated in every visual sense as a place that had actually existed. The map is disorienting at first glance because Kircher oriented it with south at the top, inverting the modern convention. The viewer's eye has to relearn the Atlantic. Once the orientation resolves, the shape emerges. A roughly diamond-shaped continent, ribbed with mountain ranges, set squarely between the coast of Spain and the Americas. Not in the deep ocean as a vague suggestion, but charted. Coastlines drawn with the same confident ink Kircher used for the Iberian Peninsula a few inches away. Rivers. Interior features. A landmass rendered with the authority of observed geography. Kircher claimed his map was copied from an Egyptian source. He did not specify which one. He did not produce the original. He simply asserted that the document had passed through Egyptian hands, and that his rendering preserved what those hands had recorded. The claim is impossible to verify, and impossible to fully dismiss. Kircher had access to materials in the Vatican archives that no longer exist. He read Coptic. He worked from manuscripts that have since been lost, destroyed, or quietly removed from circulation. Whatever he was looking at when he drew that diamond between 2 continents, he believed it was old enough and credible enough to publish under his name at the height of his scholarly reputation. The story behind the map is older than the map by more than 2,000 years. Plato, in the Timaeus and Critias, described Atlantis as a continent larger than Libya and Asia combined. A naval power that ruled the western Mediterranean and projected force into Egypt itself. A civilization of canals and concentric harbors and bronze-walled temples. And then, in a single day and a single night of catastrophe, gone. Plato dated the destruction to roughly 9,600 BC, placing the event nearly 6,000 years before the construction of the first Egyptian pyramids. He claimed the account had been preserved by Egyptian priests at Sais, who had told it to the Athenian lawgiver Solon, who had carried it back to Greece, where it had passed down through his family until it reached Plato's pen. The numbers defy comprehension. a continent larger than two of the three landmasses the Greeks knew, erased in 24 hours, 9,000 years before the philosopher who recorded it was born. But here's where the story refuses to settle into pure myth. The Greek coastline has been giving up its dead. Off the shores of the Peloponnese, beneath shallow water that tourists swim through every summer, archaeologists have uncovered the submerged remains of Bronze Age settlements. Pavlopetri, mapped in detail since 2009, sits beneath 4 meters of water and preserves streets, courtyards, and tombs from a city that sank between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago. Other sites along the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean have produced similar finds: walls beneath the waves, harbors that no ship can reach, whole neighborhoods of a vanished world, preserved in salt water because the land itself dropped. The discoveries do not prove Atlantis. They prove something more unsettling: that the Mediterranean has, repeatedly, swallowed inhabited places whole, that the geological mechanisms Plato described, sudden subsidence, catastrophic flooding, the conversion of dry land into seabed within a human lifetime, are not literary inventions. They are documented processes that have erased real settlements within the span of recorded history. Whatever Plato was working from, whatever Egyptian record Kircher believed he had recovered, the underlying claim that civilizations can sink, that maps can preserve the memory of places the ocean has consumed, is no longer the territory of legend. It is the territory of underwater archaeology. And this is where the entire pattern of this video collapses into a single question. 10 places, 10 maps. Hyperborea and Thule and Antilia and Hy-Brasil and St. Brendan's Island and Atlantis. And Mu and Tartessos and Fryceland and Prester John. Some confirmed as real, some dissolved by science, some still waiting beneath the water or buried under the sand. The cartographers who drew them were not fools. They were the best minds of their centuries, working from sources we no longer possess, recording geographies that may have been memory, myth, or something stranger than either. Kircher's diamond still floats between Spain and the Americas on a map 400 years old, oriented upside down, waiting for someone to decide whether it was invention or inheritance. The answer, if it exists, lies on a seafloor no one has yet thought to search. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.